speakers, Christopher, Andrew and Bruce Hoffman. Sadly, Bernard Blumenauer, who would have been the discussant, is laid low with the lurgy, so is unable to join us due to illness. We wish him the very speediest of recoveries. We have the advantage of the availability of a super sub as discussant, with the gentleman in the middle between our two speakers. As regards our speakers, their illustrious antecedents are fully set out for your perusal in the excellent conference programme. And as I wish to spend as much time hearing from them rather than me, and indeed you, I will invite you to revert to the programme. But there's one irresistible thought in that both Bruce and Christopher are absolute masters of the best lines in counter-terrorist literature. In Inside Terrorism, the third edition, Bruce reminds us of the memorable words of Jean-Paul Sartre, who said, "It is the moment of the boomerang, a new phase of violence that comes back on us, strikes us, and we do not realize any more than we did all the other times that is us who have launched it." Christopher opens his chapter 30 of Secret War with the sentence, "Western intelligence agencies at the end of the Cold War suffered, though they did not realize it at the time, from a serious lack of theologians." Bruce quotes Porter J. Goss in March 2003, when he was then chair of the United States House Representatives Intelligence Committee, who was reportedly saying at the time, "I believe the tide has turned in terms of Al-Qaeda. We've got them nailed." In later years, including his tenure as director of the Central Intelligence Agency, we saw the Madrid train bombings in 2004, 7/7 in London in 2005, and the airlines plot across the Atlantic in 2006. Christopher also recounts the advice in December of 1995 when MI5, the British Security Services, dismissively wrote to all heads of special branches of the United Kingdom police forces that suggestions in the press of a worldwide Islamic extremist network poised to launch terrorist attacks against the West are very greatly exaggerated. And he closes his vintage chapter 30 of The Secret World with his assertion that their repeated failures were caused by historical attention span deficit disorder, HSDD, of which we will hear more shortly, which he describes as a lack of long-term perspective without which it is impossible to understand the threat from terrorism. In his concluding chapter of The Magnificent Secret World, he writes, "It is not difficult to think of current world leaders with little or no discernible historical interests." We look forward to disclosing who that might be. Both Christopher and Bruce can both claim, I think, to have contributed greatly to the overall understanding of terrorism, and if I might say so, the operational effectiveness of counterterrorism. Christopher, by explaining the necessity of historical context rather than short-term analysis, and Bruce, by being the first to recognize the importance of the contemporary threat of Salafi jihadist terrorism from the last years of the last century up to the present day. These conclusions, I suggest, are compelling examples of the special merit, the social benefit, and the public good of the field of terrorism studies. They are squarely in the Hall of Fame of invaluable advice to operational counter-terrorists, alongside Richard English's enduring and compelling commendation not to make avoidable mistakes. Thus, if you aspire to pursue a successful career in counterterrorism, you should definitely read Christopher Andrew, Bruce Hoffman, and Richard English. May I, without further ado, invite Christopher to open our proceedings.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, David. And let me begin by quoting Richard English. So here we are. Richard English. Intelligence is the most vital element in successful counter-terrorism. End of quote. It was always thus. Not just over the last 100 years, not just over the last 1,000 years. I don't have time to go further back than the last 1,000 years. So it has always been thus. What we've had to suffer in the last generation is an onslaught from one of the great intellectual heresies of our time, historical attention span deficit disorder, HASD, the only acronym that I am going to invent for the rest of the day. So what has that done? It's provided a ludicrously foreshortened view of the role of intelligence. In reality, intelligence was at least as vital to counterterrorism in the 1580s as it was in the 1980s. And I would argue, and indeed shall argue for at least 30 seconds, that it was more successful in the 1580s than it was in the 1980s. So the word intelligence was first used in the way that intelligence agencies used it by William Shakespeare, who first used it in Richard III and used it quite often thereafter in 1593. But of course, intelligence didn't have to wait for the word to be invented to play an important role. It played an important role long before Shakespeare was thought of. So did terrorism. Shakespeare didn't invent that word, but he did invent the word assassination. So I'll begin there, partly because it takes us all the way back to yesterday morning. And I think that it's an extraordinary example of how much has been achieved in this conference, that yesterday morning, fascinating like all the other sessions, I hope including this one, but that's not certain yet, just seems so long ago. But it was only yesterday morning that Alex Schmidt, in his first talk, quoted the definition of the Russian People's Will in its 1879 manifesto, one of the great manifestos in the history of terrorism over the last 2,000 to 3,000 years. Which calls its terrorist activity, its phrase, the, quote, destruction of the most harmful persons in government. And that was exactly the view taken by the main British, more English than Scottish, terrorists at the beginning in the 1580s. So here we are. There they are. They're plotting the destruction of the most harmful person in government. And for extremist Catholics, the most harmful person in government was the Protestant Queen Elizabeth I, who they wished to replace by the Catholic Mary Queen of Scots. The only problem is you had, first of all, to get rid of Mary Queen of Scots in order to replace her. And so what did Elizabeth do? Well, I've often thought to myself how astonishingly similar Walsingham is to that other great counter-terrorist authority, Bruce Hoffman. I mean, the moustache is different and the ruff is different. But Walsingham was a clever fellow, but Bruce could have taught him a thing or two. So, what did she discuss every day? Well, you know, the combination that we nowadays think of as relatively modern, the combination of surveillance and SIGINT. Elizabeth I and Walsingham actually did it better than any other combo in British history up to really rather more recently. So what was Thomas Phillips? He was a member of the dyslexic line of the Phillips family, so he was spelled Thomas Philippes. Pay no attention to that. It's Phillips. So before the Armada, he was able to break Philip II's ciphers. And he really complained that one of them took him a week to break. Honestly, that's more than Mary Queen of Scots did. And we know that Elizabeth I paid serious attention to this. She congratulated him. She awarded him a pension. No other member of the English-British royal family has ever awarded their codebreaker a pension. So this is a cipher which I don't suppose ever took him as much longer than half an hour. It was a cipher used by Mary, Queen of Scots, broken by Phillips. And what that, of course, enables them to do is absolutely wonderful from the point of view of counterterrorism. Because all those who are seeking to replace Queen Elizabeth I by Mary, Queen of Scots, communicate with Mary, Queen of Scots, and she replies back in her cipher, which is quickly broken. Now, there's only time to mention one of them, and this is the most dangerous one of them. Sir Anthony Babington writes secretly to Mary, Queen of Scots, 1586, "There be 6 noble gentlemen, all my private friends, who for the zeal they bear to the Catholic cause and your Majesty's service will undertake that tragical execution by which they mean Elizabeth I." And this is one of the decrypted letters. And this is the one which is also the death certificate of Mary, Queen of Scots, because she replies favorably. But Phillips was a good deal more unscrupulous than I believe GCHQ nowadays to be, because when he sent back the Mary, Queen of Scots' reply after he had read it, he added a forged paragraph. And the forged paragraph is that one. He just said, "Oh, would you kindly tell me the names of the 6 noble judges?" Oh, they were really unscrupulous in those days. I mean, far more unscrupulous than the episodes commented on by the Times this morning, but that's enough of that. And there is Mary, Queen of Scots, the first monarch who is executed after the decryption of her correspondence. But at the same time, the penetration of Mary, Queen of Scots' entourage, and more particularly the entourage of the assassins, so far as we know, beats anything, and I don't underestimate it, that was achieved during the IRA period. So here's just one example. Robert Poley, a spy recruited at Clare College, Cambridge. Walsingham was from King, so he got a lot of his spies from Cambridge, and that's just one of the reports that he sent. So it's not simply SIGINT. This is individual surveillance. And Poley succeeds in becoming the best friend of the assassin-in-chief, Babington. And he can't really believe, Babington, so fond of Poley, he gives him an expensive diamond ring. And he writes to him just before he's about to be hanged, drawn, and quartered in 1586. "Farewell, sweet Robin, if as I take thee true to me, if not, adieu, vilest of all 2-footed creatures." Counterterrorism does not actually get better than that. And I know of no example since 1586, as far as England is concerned, it has got even as good as that. Now, what's the evidence? Well, royal frocks. I mean, one of the problems, I think, about terrorist studies is that my book will be the first one which you will find illustrated by some of the best royal frocks in British history. Now, these are an essential source, so have a look at this one. It's Queen Elizabeth I. It was the last portrait that was painted of her, given her a couple of years before she died. They always followed her strict instructions. So just look at her face. She's 29 3/4, as she had been ever since she was 29 3/4. It's called the rainbow portrait because for some odd reason she's holding a rainbow. She's obviously completely bored by it, not even looking at the rainbow. But on the cloak, there are 2 symbols, and 2 symbols only, which sum up the entire history of British counter-terrorism. And now you can see them. their eyes and ears. What do they mean? Don't even think about it, terrorists. My boys, this was not an equal opportunity profession in those ignorant days, my boys can see everything you do and hear everything you say, which is why when MI5 was finally started in 1909, they copied their initial symbol off the dress of Queen Elizabeth I. That is to say, the all-seeing eye. So I'm sorry those are the end of the pictures. The reason is not because I've in any way run out of pictures, but I think that the conference felt quite rightly that 3.5 hours might be too long for my talk, so we will have no picture later than that one. And I will simply go through a number of the themes which I think to be of particular importance and relate them to some of the absolutely fascinating things we've heard over the last couple of days. So we'll stick with that image while I'm doing it. Now, the history of counterterrorism, like the history of intelligence, is not linear. It is perfectly possible to find British intelligence 200 years on worse than it had been 200 years before. And of course, one good example of how quickly things can go backwards is the only British national celebration of the last few hundred years, which was the Gunpowder Plot, which, after all, was only a couple of days. Do I mean a couple of days? Anyway, it was the evening of the 5th. And what that demonstrates is that James VI and I's intelligence community was not in the same class as Elizabeth's, nor 3.5 centuries later was British counter-terrorist intelligence, when the IRA bombing campaigns emerged as a serious threat at the end of the 1960s. I mean, I do find it difficult even to construct an argument that British counterterrorism was good in the 1960s, as in the 1580s, but there'll be plenty of opportunity to discuss that. Why? Well, Walsingham would never have tolerated the confused counter-terrorist organisation for which successive British governments were responsible over the quarter century after the bombing campaign begins in the 1960s, and a confusion which is responsible, for example, for the fact that IRA assassination attempts came far closer to killing 2 successive British prime ministers than they ever did to killing Queen Elizabeth I. Now, it's worth parenthetically making the point that assassination was a real problem, and not simply in Scotland. In Scotland, after all, Linlithgow, 50 miles from where we are at the present time, was the first ruler, the regent for the infant James VI, to be assassinated by firearms. And not long after, William the Silent, in the almost independent Dutch territories, in Delft, where he was assassinated, in the house there, they have still kept not merely the bullets, but the bullet holes in the wall. 2 successive kings of France were assassinated. So this was not a trivial problem. You had, even in the great age of assassination, before the First World War, I mean, heads of state were not more secure, less secure than they were later. So what's the difference? Well, you're not ever going to get a really successful counter-terrorist organization unless the people at the top are paying as much attention as Walsingham and Elizabeth I did. So what happens for most of the 20th century, up until the 1990s, is that nobody is paying attention. So you get the evidence by this, for this, by the way, is not the least bit doubtful, and I've gone on about it in my authorized history written when I was official historian of MI5. So it's almost impossible to believe now that up to 1992, 1993, if there was an Irish terrorist threat in mainland Britain, it was MI5's responsibility if it was a Republican. If it was a loyalist, I beg your pardon, if it was the police's responsibility, if it was a Republican, if the terrorist was a loyalist, it was MI5's responsibility. Now, if you tried to devise a crazier system of dealing with Irish terrorism in Britain, I challenge anybody to think of a system like that. And of course, neither Bruce nor Walsingham would have stood for it for a moment. But anyway, all is well. I mean, Margaret Thatcher didn't mind too much being assassinated because she well, or at any rate, it sort of made her feel the providential role. But, you know, John Major came from the lower middle class, and he had a typical lower middle class attitude towards attempts at assassination. He took it really, really personally, honestly. It just shows he didn't go to university. So he still whinges about this and that, although what he's whinging about at the present time, I really rather agree with him. So he wasn't having any of this nonsense about him being assassinated, so it all had to be rationalised, and the chief intelligence role for all kinds of terrorists was then given to MI5, and MI5 worked absolutely wonderfully with the Metropolitan Police, so it all had a happy outcome. But all you've got to do is compare how Patrick McGee became the Brighton bomber. He was absolutely hopeless. He spent, as I did, that is I mean, we both have PhDs and we both grew up in Norwich. But I'd like to draw to your attention that our profiles are significantly different in many other ways. So if he'd been under the kind of surveillance that Barrington had been, or Ralph Friars was in the mid-1990s after the reform, he would never, I think, have become the Brighton bomber. So and now on to another aspect of historical attention span deficit disorder. I mean, there's this extraordinary belief at the present time that Snowden has caused more outrage than his predecessors in the Victorian era. I mean, just about beyond belief. And of course, Queen Victoria's now is very fashionable because the BBC, not simply the BBC, do all these wonderful pictures on it. So, you know, it has to be said, I think, unlike Germany, unlike the United States, irrespective of what we think of as the strengths and weaknesses of the Snowden case, they've not had very much effect on public opinion. Now, compare that with 1844. 1844, the very popular Italian lunatic, very distinguished Italian revolutionary and nationalist, Giuseppe Mazzini, his correspondence was intercepted. And I exaggerate not at all. I have written it up, but there's no need to look at what I've written up. And from the moment that his silly letters were intercepted, the whole of Parliament went into something approaching meltdown. And by the way, what Macaulay said during that was absolutely fascinating. Wonderful example of Macaulay actually believing that torturing people was good from an intelligence point of view, but nonetheless, you must never do it. These are fascinating debates, but because they're in Hansard and nobody reads Hansard any longer, they have not been paid much attention to. So the consequence of the meltdown in Parliament, the meltdown in Punch, the meltdown in the Times, of the opening of Mazzini's correspondence, was that the government, with the full support, indeed initiative of Parliament, closed down GCHQ. We had had a code-breaking agency ever since Phillips, mispronounced Philippus. But the next 70 years, we don't have one, which is why up to the First World War, when we enter the First World War, unlike our allies, the French and the Russians, they have code-breaking organizations. We don't have one at all. So the human rights issues were actually paid far more attention to and had a bigger impact on policy in the early to mid-Victorian era than they have had in the last 10 or 20 years. So now closer to the the present. And one of the biggest problems, it seems to me, over the last generation, and thank you for quoting that passage from my book, has been understanding terrorist motivation. Easy during the assassination plots against Elizabeth I. Easy during the Fenian Dynamite War. Actually, fairly easy in the mid-1990s, but hardly anyone got onto it. And the reason, I mean, we've had some brilliant discussions of the complexity of the relationship between religious extremism and the terrorism of the last generation. But the one lesson which nobody took at the time is that the links between the two are such that if you don't have religious historians and theologians in your intelligence service, you are suffering from an acute attack of, forgive me, hazed. It's just that in the secular era, religious belief is in one compartment and terrorism is another compartment, which is extremely foolish. And David quoted what MI5 said to the heads of all the special branches in 1995, suggestions in the press of a worldwide Islamic extremist network poised to launch terrorist attacks against the West are greatly exaggerated, and so on and so on. General James Clapper, President Obama's Director of National Intelligence, recalls that while he was head of the Defense Intelligence Agency from 1991 to 1995, there wasn't a single high-level Washington discussion of the links between religious extremism and inspiring terrorism. Now, I knew far better than MI5, and I knew far better than Clapper. Why? Because even before Bruce produced his book, I had read his wonderful article on Holy Terror. So there we are. Bruce was ahead of the game, and I was second because I'd read his article. But that's as close as I got. And of course, but even in retrospect, hardly anyone points out the serious shortage of theologians. Now, let me briefly take you back to Bruce's lookalike, and that's the last time I'll make that pretentious joke. Walsingham was a theologian as well as a spy master. He had a series of theological works dedicated to him. And what did he succeed in doing? He succeeded in penetrating the Catholic seminary at Reims, which sent missionaries over to return the people to the old faith. And he had also penetrated with another playwright, it was Marlowe who penetrated that one, the English College in Rome. So the decline in British counter-terrorism over a period of 300 years has partly to do with the fact that there was no understanding, as there had been before, that you couldn't do counter-terrorism unless you took some serious interest in religion. And what is also striking about intelligence analysis of that period is that even when the Islamist threat comes to the fore, there is almost no evidence of a serious attempt to look at the Prophet Muhammad's use of military intelligence. Well, Muhammad's most widely read Muslim biographer today, the award-winning biography by Safiur Rahman al-Mubarakpuri, concludes, like other biographers, that the Prophet was the greatest military leader in the entire world, winning, if the Orthodox version is to be believed, 27 battles as well as 50 armed raids. Now, because the Quran is about the message, not the messenger, it has little to say about the Prophet's use of intelligence. By contrast, the hadiths, the sacred records of Muhammad's words and deeds, give many examples of his use of intelligence during his military campaigns. And I've quoted quite a number of them in my most recent book, and also the way that Khomeini claims to be following the example of Muhammad when he issues a fatwa calling for the killing of Salman Rushdie, and he's able to give examples of assassinations ordered by the Prophet for blasphemy. So now I reach a conclusion which is, well, everything that I haven't had time to say has been heavily influenced by everything that people have said. But I'm now coming on to one of the most recent ones, which is Audrey Cronin. HASD is, and this links with, but perhaps develops in a slightly different direction, the fact that historical attention span deficit disorder is currently a greater problem in China than in the West. But the difference in China, that it is officially imposed. In the 30 years since the Tiananmen Square massacre and killings in other countries, in other parts of China, the Chinese Ministry of State Security, assisted by a vast army of online censors, has helped turn China into what Louisa Lim calls the best book title, including all of mine, that I have read in recent years, and Louisa Lim's book title, which is about current People's Republic, she calls it the People's Republic of Amnesia, and the way in which they've destroyed all popular memory. But you know, the way that they've managed to convince the West, you know, it's now almost beyond belief that 22 Uyghurs were mistakenly included in the alleged terrorists interned by the United States in Guantanamo Bay after 9/11. And Audrey, you referred to what's going on in Xinjiang at the present time. But 1 million people in internment camps, only able to move around by using a prescribed software on their smartphones, which they have on demand to hand over to be downloaded. This is extraordinary, and the most extraordinary thing of all is that until last week, it went virtually unprotested by the West. But last week, at the UN General Assembly, the UK Permanent Representative, Karen Pierce, issued a statement on behalf of 23 countries, including the US, Canada, Japan, Australia, detailing, quote, credible reports of mass detention, efforts to restrict cultural and religious practices, mass surveillance, and so on. So the 23 countries protest, but the New Silk Road can cope with that, because no sooner did it come out than a contrary petition put out by Beijing's ally Belarus. 54 countries, far more than the 23, which praise China's counter-terrorism program in Xinjiang for, quote, effectively safeguarding the basic human rights of people of all ethnic groups. So, you know, historical attention span deficit disorder, the program run from Beijing, is at the moment triumphant in the United Nations, amongst other places. So I'm now, you'll be pleased to know, on my final paragraph. So I'm obviously going to quote Winston Churchill. And this is what Winston says: the further backwards you look, the further forward you can see. So we understand far more about the major future threat from terrorism by looking back for 2,000 years than we do from looking back 100 years. Why? Because the most recent relatively low-tech threats to Western security are not the future. So my view is that there are only two constants in the human history over the last 3,000 years, and I'm not going to stop to give the evidence, but one is human nature. There is no credible evidence that human nature has changed, and you would expect it to in a period as short as 3,000 years. The other thing is the absolute inevitability of all human inventions proliferating around the world. It used to take quite a long time. The New World, which used to, forgive me, be a bit dim, it took 1,000 years to catch up with the wheel. But, you know, it's moved beyond that nowadays. So the idea that WMD is going to be the only invention in the history of the human race not to proliferate, you would have to have what seems to me a near terminal attack of the very last time I mentioned it, historical attention span deficit disorder, to believe that one. Thank you for your goodwill.
It's now the great pleasure for one humble knight to introduce another learned knight of the realm of the United Kingdom, Lord Walsingham.
Thank you. Tough to top that introduction and Chris's presentation, so I'll have to struggle to do so. But first, I would like to ask the indulgence of the chair not to deduct 2 minutes from my time.
May I assure you, you
Okay.
have your absolute full allotment.
Okay, because I think
however
I'm-
you wish, because the discussion has promised to be absolutely remarkably brief.
Okay. Well, I think I'm bang on 30 minutes, but I did want to say a couple of things. First, as the final paper of this conference, I would be remiss not to say how impoverished we are by the fact that our cherished colleague, Paul Wilkinson, isn't here with us today. I know when Paul and I first talked about establishing the center 25 years ago, our vision was to have a center that brought together students, and especially to have these kinds of things be for students, scholars, and practitioners, something that's not always that popular, in magnificent setting like St. Andrews, but especially in such a productive and really, I think, very richly rewarding conference, such as the past 2 days. And we're really indebted to Tim, to Jillian, and to Kim for fulfilling the vision that Paul and I had 25 years ago. And I think it's just beyond sad that Paul isn't here today. Secondly, at 65 years old, I finally have a gray beard, so I can take my position in that, that hallowed collection, and as passing on some, if not fatherly, but avuncular advice to some of the students or the younger people here. I just hope you appreciate how absolutely unique this conference has been. This is the first time, I think, in memory that we have literally the founding fathers of the field of terrorism present here with also the next generation, and I was one of the next generation. But 40 years ago, or 43 years ago to be exact, when I first started studying terrorism, it was exactly people like Paul and Martha and Alex and Max and Mark who I looked up to. And to have that old guard, their successors, and all of you who are the successive generation in one room has really made this a remarkable conference. So we're in your debt, Tim, Jillian, and Kim, for that as well. And then I would really be remiss not to say 2 things about 2 people. I first met Sir David 27 years ago at St. Andrews at a conference here that Paul had organized on terrorism and technology. David, in my view, has exemplified precisely the scholar practitioner that has contributed to the field of terrorism studies. Even though he hasn't written as much as some of the other people in this room, he was unique and way ahead of his time firstly, as a cop educated at Cambridge, which I dare say is much more common now than back then, but someone who had this open, inquiring mind that always looked to the academy to cooperate with and not to be at loggerhead with, who mentored and encouraged his subordinates to get PhDs, and especially at a time when some of our friends and colleagues in the critical terrorism studies domain write editorials saying that scholars of terrorism should no longer have anything to do with anyone in power. I think Sir David is an example of the kind of fortuitous bonds and cooperation that results from these types of relationships. And that, at the end of the day, saves lives. I don't think it is at all a coincidence, and I'm sure David in his immense modesty will disagree with me, but during the dozen or so years, or 14 years that you were Assistant Commissioner of Metropolitan Police, up until 2004, there were no major terrorist incidents in that city, or certainly none that tragically followed since. And part of that was because his openness and a very broad perspective, which is something we need to continue in the field. And then finally, before I launch into my talk, I would really be remiss not to praise Chris Andrew, who has been a pioneer in the study of intelligence, certainly, but also in terrorism, because of the encouragement he has given to generations of scholars to look at this often ignored, and in many cases for mainstream history departments, dismissed field of terrorism and intelligence studies, which is to look at the intelligence archives. I wouldn't have written the book Anonymous Soldiers without Chris's encouragement and tireless support. Chris is also another academician who has bridged the gap, as it were, with practitioners, bringing the intelligence community closer to academia, and the fact that we had Lord Evans here yesterday is testament, I think, to the very productive relationships that we can and that we should have with people in government agencies. So, now on to the paper. And it will start with another historical analogy, but then move on to actually today and tomorrow. And now this will be my 30 minutes, I hope. The famed British Foreign Office Mandarin, an opponent of his country's pre-war appeasement policy towards Germany, Sir Robert Vansittart, could have been referring to 2019 when he observed of the 1930s that, left or right, everybody was for the quiet life. How else can one explain President Trump's abandonment of the Kurds in northern Syria by withdrawing the few remaining American military forces along the border with Turkey in order to finally cease what he described as these stupid, endless wars? Or what else accounts for the Trump administration's now abandoned but meretricious courtship of the Taliban, the credulous, one-sided negotiations that unfolded despite escalating terrorist attacks, and the unseemly invitation to the leaders of a movement that was complicit in precisely the tragic events commemorated on September 11th for talks at the presidential Camp David retreat just days before that anniversary? The Democratic presidential candidates who debated later that same week as the Taliban talks collapsed had little to offer themselves in terms of clarity or new policy options for either Afghanistan or the war on terrorism. From thoroughly discredited nostrums linking terrorism to poverty, to glib declamations about the need to bring the troops home, alongside a pledge to end the forever wars, the debate on these issues, as the Washington Post opined, served up evasions and fantasies not much different from the cut-and-run impulse that at times seems to be animating Mr. Trump's outreach to the Taliban. But prophecy is not policy, and as the commander of the U.S. Central Command presciently reminded us back in 2013, no war is over until the enemy says it's over. We may think it is over, we may declare it over, General James Mattis explained, but in fact, the enemy always gets a vote. And despite U.S. military expenditures now totaling some $2 trillion and ongoing counterterrorism missions today being conducted in 80 countries on 6 continents, our enemies have incontrovertibly voted to continue this war. Indeed, according to the Global Extremist Monitor, a total of 121 violent Islamist groups are active throughout the world. In 2017, the last year for which data has been published, they carried out an average of 21 attacks per day that affected 66 countries. Although a report released by the CSIS Transnational Threats Project cites a lower figure of only 67 such organizations, even this more modest number still represents a 180% increase in the number of Salafi jihadi groups that existed on September 11th, 2001. Regardless of which calculation is more accurate, neither points to the timeless conclusion of this war. It is thus hard to deny that if Osama bin Laden were alive today, he'd likely be a happy man. The enterprise he begat over 3 decades ago has survived the sustained onslaught of the most technologically advanced military in the history of mankind. Despite serial setbacks, including the killing of its founder and leader, the narrative that he crafted continues to resonate and inspire a new generation to take up arms in a war that bin Laden first proclaimed 23 years ago, before many of the latest recruits were even born. In an interview with a Pakistani journalist shortly after the 9/11 attacks, bin Laden predicted that his martyrdom will, quote unquote, create more Osama bin Ladens. Both al-Qaeda's continued longevity and the fact that today it is present in more countries than it was on 9/11 and can muster some 30,000 to 40,000 fighters has arguably proven bin Laden correct. As has the rise of ISIS, an even more extreme variant of al-Qaeda that attracted over 40,000 foreign fighters from more than 120 different countries to its now defunct caliphate. In approximately 4 years, ISIS's international cadre surpassed even the most lavish estimates of the number of foreign fighters that the U.S. intelligence community believes journeyed to Afghanistan to join al-Qaeda during the 1980s and 1990s. ISIS's own stubborn resiliency was last year highlighted in the new U.S. National Strategy for Counterterrorism released by the White House and the National Security Council. Despite ISIS's catastrophic military setbacks in Syria and Iraq, the document nonetheless cautioned, and I'm quoting, that the group's global reach remains robust, with 8 official branches and more than 24 networks regularly conducting terrorist and insurgent operations across Africa, Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. Unfortunately, this was not the only bad news that the strategy imparted. In addition to ISIS and the continuing threat posed by al-Qaeda, which had monopolized the 3 previous iterations of the strategy, released respectively in 2003, 2006, and 2011, the 2018 edition also listed Iran and Iranian-backed Shia militias, domestic violent far-right and far-left extremists, and militant single-issue organizations as significant security concerns. It is beyond the scope of this brief overview, and this is obviously briefer than the paper I delivered before the conference, to discuss each. I will focus on a few of these continuing threats only, on ISIS, al-Qaeda, and the violent far-right and the violent far-left, as well as incels. Now, we've talked so much about ISIS and a little bit about al-Qaeda the past few days. I'm going to do something different and go to the end and then come back to the beginning. The end of the paper was about the violent. I want to make sure that I have enough time to talk about the violent far-right, far-left, and incels, and then we can come back, if I still have time, to ISIS and al-Qaeda, which we've already discussed. For the past couple of decades, we have rightly been focused on the threat from Salafi jihadi Islamist organizations like al-Qaeda and ISIS. American law enforcement, however, has long warned of the threat from the violent far-right. A 2004 FBI strategic planning document, for instance, at the height of the war against al-Qaeda, firmly placed the lone wolf threat in the United States within the context of the threat from the indigenous far-right, at a time when everyone was completely obsessed with al-Qaeda. This assessment accurately presaged the series of mass shootings that have occurred in the United States over the past 14 months. At a Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania synagogue where 11 worshipers were killed, and at an El Paso, Texas shopping center where 22 persons perished, among other incidents. This spate of attacks challenged some of our most fundamental conceptualizations about terrorists and terrorism. In the past, a terrorist was mostly recognizable as someone committing violence at the deliberate behest of, or on behalf of, or at least inspired by, some existent organizational entity or movement that had an identifiable chain of command. Each of these tragic attacks, however, was perpetrated by a lone gunman without any demonstrable affiliation to or membership in an identifiable terrorist organization. Each involved a lone, male gunman acting entirely on his own, who was neither directly commanded nor specifically encouraged by an established terrorist group leader, propagandist, or spokesperson. Nor, sadly, is this phenomena confined to the United States. Last March, another lone gunman attacked 2 mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand, killing 51 persons. This leaderless strategy, in fact, has its origins not in the Middle East or with a foreign Muslim terrorist organization, but in America and with its own peculiar variant of extreme far-right terrorism. It dates to the early 1980s, when, frustrated by the FBI's success in penetrating the racist white supremacist movement then active in the western United States, a Vietnam War veteran and former Grand Dragon of the Texas Ku Klux Klan named Louis Beam conceived of his leaderless resistance strategy. It was based on the Turner Diaries, a futuristic novel published in 1979 by an avowed white supremacist that the FBI has termed the movement's quote-unquote Bible. Beam's concept was to avoid the mistakes of the past, whereby white supremacist groups were undermined and ultimately neutralized by federal informants. His idea was instead to encourage persons who would operate completely independently of one another, but through their individual terrorist acts would serve and fulfill the aims and ambitions of the broader ideological movement inspiring them. ISIS's remarkable success in speaking to a global audience via social media and digital means is yet another inheritance from Beam and America's own domestic terrorists. In the early 1980s, he pioneered the use of primitive computer bulletin boards as a means for like-minded hate mongers in the United States, Canada, and West Germany to communicate with and inspire one another, as well as to circulate manifestos and ideological treatises outlawed by at least one of those countries. Beam had therefore positioned the 21st century far right to exploit the advanced capabilities afforded by the internet, the World Wide Web, and the variety of social media and messaging apps available today. The Christchurch gunman, for example, took full advantage of modern communications technologies, both before and during his attack. He hinted at it on Twitter, publicized it on the anonymous message board 8chan, and posted links to his 74-page manifesto titled The Great Replacement, explaining himself and his actions on both media. He also strapped a camera to his forehead in order to live stream the shootings and posted more links on the internet with instructions on how to access that footage. Nearly half a century ago, terrorism expert Brian Jenkins famously described terrorism as theater. The power of social media turned the terrorist attack in New Zealand into a heinous act of performance art, designed to inspire imitation and emulation elsewhere. For example, the attacks were live streamed for 17 minutes and viewed at least 4,000 times before Facebook took down the link. Over the next 24 hours, Facebook removed another 1.5 million copies of the live-streamed attack from its pages. YouTube recorded one upload per second of the assault from its website during the 24 hours following the incident and before it was taken down. Since the Christchurch attacks, at least 2 additional white nationalist gunmen have sought to live stream their attacks on Jewish synagogues. Both incidents occurred on Jewish holidays. The Poway's, California shooting that killed 1 person and wounded 3 others coincided with the last day of Passover and the Jewish Sabbath. The most recent attack happened in Halle, Germany on Yom Kippur, the Jewish religion's most sacred holiday, in which 2 persons were killed. Before being quickly removed from social media sites, it had been downloaded over 2,000 times. White nationalist terrorism and its violent, politically motivated variants, embracing racism, anti-Semitism, anti-immigration, and anti-government sentiments, have existed in the United States, United Kingdom, France, Germany, Italy, Austria, Australia, and Scandinavian countries for decades. The difference is that in the past, these acts were mostly isolated, spasmodic outbursts of violence. Today, however, the internet and social media are capable of uniting disparate, disgruntled individuals into an ideologically more cohesive echo chamber that serves as a platform to radicalize, inspire, motivate, and ultimately animate violent acts of increasing severity. Increased attention has also been increasingly focused in the United States and elsewhere on the threat posed by violent far-left as well as far-right extremists, as well as on newly emergent single-issue movements such as the incels or involuntary celibates. First, the violent far-left. The 2017 violent street protests and clashes between far-right and far-left extremists that occurred in Charlottesville, Virginia, and Berkeley, California, revealed the determination of militants associated with Antifa, the anagram of the anti-fascist movement, self-proclaimed anarchists, and the so-called Black Bloc as well, to stage violent confrontations with white supremacists and the alt-right. Like their extremist far-right counterparts, the violent extremist far-left in the United States and other countries belong to no actual existing organization with leadership or a chain of command, but rather are united by a common imperative. These collectives demonstrated at President Trump's inauguration, and over 200 persons were arrested. The authorities ultimately decided not to try these persons on charges of vandalism, assault, and other disorderly behavior. Law enforcement authorities now worry that this has emboldened the militants and will lead to increased violence during the upcoming 2020 presidential primary and electoral campaigns. A warning sign of the potential escalation of violent far-left extremism morphing into terrorism occurred last July when a long-term activist attempted to firebomb a Tacoma, Washington Immigration and Customs Enforcement facility. The term involuntary celibate, or incel, takes its name from a website created in 1993 by a young female undergraduate at Canada's Carleton University that she eponymously titled Alana's Involuntary Celibacy Project. Although it was originally conceived as a predominantly women-oriented site to share memories and experiences and perhaps find support and empathy, it unintentionally became popular with men complaining about their own involuntary celibacy. Among those who adopted the name incel that this woman had coined was someone named Elliot Rodger. Rodger is considered the patron saint, a cultural touchstone for incels today, and is credited with the first incel attack. On May 23, 2014, Rodger killed 6 persons and wounded 14 others in Isla Vista, California, before committing suicide. As has become de rigueur for today's white supremacist shooters, Rodger also left behind a 133-page manifesto. It was titled My Twisted Life. And he also posted numerous misogynist videos on YouTube. Dozens of online forums, from Reddit, subreddits, to incels.co to 4chan and 8chan, now exist where self-identified members of the incel community bemoan their collective fate. They believe that they have been profoundly disadvantaged by their race, religion, socioeconomic status, and thus victimized by society. The incels' fundamental complaint is that they have been systematically deprived of their right to sexual relations. These men are therefore involuntarily celibate because of social stratification, structures, and mores that they claim and blame deny them their human rights of having a relationship and sex with women. Rodger's manifesto and YouTube videos exulted in the use of violence and retaliation for this serial rejection by women. Through his attack, Rodger deliberately sought to terrorize women and inspire a broader uprising of men to follow in his footsteps. Incel online forums also often describe the fate of other incels in stark terms, either to LDAR, that is to lay down and rot, or to go ER, that is to emulate Elliot Rodger's violence. Alex Manassian, a Canadian incel who killed 10 persons and injured 16 others in a 2018 vehicular attack in Toronto, posted messages on Facebook about how, quote, the incel rebellion has already begun. All hail to the supreme gentleman, Elliot Rodger, Manassian gushed. At least 30 persons have been killed and 42 others wounded in definitively proven incel-linked or inspired attacks since 2014 in the United States and Canada. In sum, none of the above terrorists, so I'm talking about violent far-right, violent far-left, and incels, none of the above terrorists, whether left, right, or incels, conforms to the traditional model of terrorism. Accordingly, they challenge counterterrorism policies and strategies which have long been oriented towards targeting terrorist organizations and their identified leaders. Because of the power of the internet, social media, and other 21st century communications platforms, the threat is changing and evolving rapidly, and the relevant authorities, both in the United States and elsewhere, need to be fully knowledgeable about these dangerous advances in radicalization and recruitment, the ease of exchanging operational and attack information online, and the likely indicators whose recognition would facilitate or might facilitate intervention, prevention, and the thwarting of these types of future terrorist incidents. Briefly, in the few minutes left, let me look at ISIS and al-Qaeda.
You're good.
Okay. It's actually more than half. ISIS rebounded quickly from last week's killing of its founder and leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. Only a few days had passed before it had announced a successor, Abu Ibrahim al-Qureshi, and before the group had issued a new call to battle. At the risk of stating the obvious, at least historically, terrorism and territory have never been coterminous. Terrorists historically have been able to prosecute sustained violent campaigns absent the accoutrements of governance, possession of vast geographical expanse, or control over populations that the Islamic State once exercised. Continued access to sanctuary and safe haven, sufficient finances, a compelling ideology, and an enduring appeal have always been the fundamental requirements of terrorist organizations. Accordingly, ISIS's unremitting capacity for violence remains. Its battlefield defeats and the demise of the short-lived Islamic State have astonishingly neither eroded ISIS' appeal nor undermined its transnational reach. Indeed, while the physical caliphate was crumbling, ISIS was nonetheless spreading to new locales, such as the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Cameroon, Chad, and Sri Lanka. The 2019 Easter Sunday suicide bombings underscore ISIS's undiminished allure to extremists, even in places where ISIS hitherto had little to no presence. Planning for so complex a terrorist operation likely predated the shootings at the two mosques in Christchurch just weeks before. Nonetheless, the fact that two entirely local collections of militants with a hitherto limited capacity of violence saw advantage in allying themselves with ISIS, despite the group's declining fortunes, establishes a worrisome precedent that is unlikely to prove unique. A key dimension of the Sri Lankan attacks may have been the terrorist cell's ability to harness the experience of at least one member named Jamil Mohammed Abdul Latif, who had left Sri Lanka in 2014 to join ISIS. Latif's survival and escape from Syria is also by no means atypical. Only about 10,000 of the 40,000 foreign fighters who came to fight with ISIS in the Levant and Iraq have in fact been killed. At least 15,000 were reportedly able to flee the caliphate before its collapse. Of this number, approximately 7,500 returned home, of whom only about half are imprisoned or are being actively monitored by local authorities. 5,000 others were deported by Turkey without notification given either to the recipient governments or to those countries of whom they are citizens. 2,500 more found sanctuary in the Sudan, and about 2,700 others migrated to ISIS branches elsewhere. Approximately 8,000 are believed to be fighting in the remaining pockets of Syria and Iraq where ISIS has a presence, and in Iraq where the group has launched a new insurgency. Another noteworthy feature of both the Sri Lanka attacks and other ISIS operations in recent years is the frequency that siblings are involved. Two brothers, who were the sons of a wealthy Sri Lankan spice trader, were among the Easter Sunday bombings. 4 sets of brothers comprised the 10-person terrorist cell in Catalonia responsible for the Barcelona and Cambrils attacks. 2 brothers participated in the November 2015 Paris attacks, and 2 brothers carried out the March 2016 dual suicide bombings at Brussels International Airport and a downtown metro stop. Admittedly, siblings have long been involved in al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups' incidents. But in recent years, ISIS has consistently turned terrorism into a family activity. A husband and wife, for instance, were responsible for the mass shooting in San Bernardino, California in December 2015. 3 brothers were implicated in a plot to blow up an Etihad Airways passenger plane en route from Sydney to Abu Dhabi in July 2017. And 3 sets of families were implicated in the May 2018 suicide bombings of 3 churches in Surabaya, Indonesia, the country's 2nd largest city. Among them was a family of 6, including a 9-year-old daughter and her 3 brothers, ages 18, 16, and 12. Another family of 6 with 4 children, ages 10 through 17, and a family of 5, among whom was their 8-year-old daughter. Penetrating an ISIS terrorist cell not comprised of close-knit family is arguably already sufficiently challenging for the authorities in any of these countries. But gaining access to an intimate nuclear family presents different operational security challenges of an entirely more formidable magnitude. In sum, ISIS today appears unbowed by its battlefield defeats, the loss of its caliphate, and the death of its founding leader. We should therefore be very circumspect that we have any better understanding of ISIS's post-caliphate capabilities and intentions today than we did when the group first emerged. It is perhaps worth recalling that the 2015 Paris attacks was the biggest terrorist attack on a Western city in over a decade. They occurred with no advance warning and in defiance of the prevailing analytical assumption that ISIS wasn't interested in mounting external attacks and, moreover, lacked the capability to do so. Indeed, just 2 weeks earlier, ISIS was able to perpetuate the single most significant attack against commercial aviation in more than a decade. Over 200 persons perished when a bomb exploded shortly after takeoff aboard a Russian charter jet. That this incident, like recent operations linked to ISIS, was undertaken by its comparatively less technologically sophisticated branches points to the long-standing capacity of the movement's appendages to independently execute highly consequential terrorist attacks, regardless of senior leadership, guidance, or direct orders. These incidents, like the recent Easter Sunday attack in Sri Lanka that similarly surprised everyone, suggest caution in precipitously declaring ISIS 100% defeated, as even President Trump himself drew back on last week. Okay, and finally, let me talk about al-Qaeda. While ISIS has dominated the headlines and preoccupied our attention for the past 5 years, al-Qaeda has been quietly rebuilding. Al-Qaeda today is numerically larger and present in more countries than at any time in its history. From Northwest Africa to Southeast Asia, al-Qaeda has maintained a global movement of some 24 local networks. Among the multitude of Salafi jihadi factions present in Syria's Idlib province, al-Qaeda today remains the most influential, and thus has the potential to fill the vacuum created by the collapse of the Islamic State there. In all, al-Qaeda now has tens of thousands of fighters, with potentially as many as 20,000 in Syria, 10,000 in North Africa, another 4,000 in Yemen, and some 7,000 in Somalia. Al-Qaeda's success in resurrecting its global network is the result of 3 key decisions taken by its leader, Ayman al-Zawahiri. The first was strengthening the movement's decentralized franchise approach, the same one that has ensured al-Qaeda's survival since the dark days following the commencement of the U.S.-led global war on terrorism nearly 2 decades ago. Since then, the leaders and deputies of al-Qaeda's disparate franchises have been integrated into the movement's deliberative and consultative processes. Today, al-Qaeda is truly global, having effectively melded local concerns into an all-encompassing worldwide grand strategy that homogenizes global-local distinctions across the movement. The second key decision was the order given by al-Zawahiri in 2013 to avoid mass casualty operations, especially those that might kill Muslim civilians and innocent women and children. At a time when ISIS was soon running rampant, with fresh atrocities succeeding one another, the new al-Qaeda leaders' move proved to be a prescient strategic gambit. Al-Qaeda accordingly has been able to present itself paradoxically, and this is their terminology, as moderate extremists, an ostensibly more palatable and acceptable rival to ISIS. The fact that al-Qaeda is just as ambitious, but far more patient and calculating than ISIS, is thus lost on many, who not only actively support and assist it, but seek to partner with what they perversely regard as a more acceptable and reasonable alternative. This development reflects al-Zawahiri's third key strategic decision of letting ISIS take all the heat and absorb all the blows from the coalition arrayed against it, while al-Qaeda unobtrusively rebuilt its military strength and basks in its newfound cachet as moderates, in contrast to the unconstrained ISIS. Anyone inclined to be taken in by this ruse would do well to heed the admonition of Theo Padnos, who changed his name from Peter, a journalist who changed his name from Peter Theocritus, who spent 2 years in Syria as a Nusra Front hostage. Padnos relates how the group's senior commanders, and I'm quoting Padnos, were inviting Westerners to the jihad in Syria, not so much because they needed more foot soldiers, they didn't, but because they want to teach the Westerners to take the struggle into every neighborhood and subway back home, close quote. The big question now, and I am ending the talk, is will the killing of al-Baghdadi prove a boon to al-Qaeda? The prospect that the rump of ISIS in Syria and Iraq might ally itself with al-Qaeda is a distinct possibility, despite their public hostile divorce in 2014. Should ISIS's branches in Africa and South Asia follow suit, the West would face a renewed and perhaps even greater global terrorist threat. Several factors would seem to support this possibility, including that the two organizations share essentially identical ideologies, that their estrangement was more a product of a clash of their leaders' egos than differences in core beliefs, and that ISIS's once compelling attraction to foreign fighters and homegrown recruits alike is now likely to have been diminished, if not reversed, by the loss of the caliphate and by Baghdadi's own killing. A merger would result in a terrorist force of chilling dimensions and influence. Their combined power could prove compelling enough to persuade competing Islamist insurgent groups in the region, like Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, al-Qaeda's former Syrian franchise, to merge into an umbrella organization or movement led by al-Zawahiri. Indeed, relations between Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, al-Qaeda, and other militant factions, including Hurras al-Din, al-Qaeda's new stalking horse in Syria, have warmed in recent months. Each appears to have set aside their differences and united under the leadership of Hurras al-Din's commander, Abdul Karim al-Masri. This could provide a precedent for a broader unification effort. It is also noteworthy that al-Masri has publicly urged a resumption of international terrorist attacks against the West, including the use of chemical weapons. The decapitation of any terrorist group inevitably affects its ability to recruit. Al-Baghdadi tried to protect his legacy by martyring himself with his suicide vest, rather than dying at the hands of infidels. But his death will still be a serious blow to the ISIS brand, harming its ability to project strength and resilience. This again may benefit al-Qaeda, which has long styled itself as a more strategic and more mature alternative to ISIS's blitzkrieg caliphate. With al-Baghdadi gone, al-Qaeda's image may once again be more attractive to aspiring jihadists. Perhaps more than anything else, al-Qaeda is keen to acquire ISIS's excellent social media skills, as well as its ability to strike in places as far-flung as Western Europe and South Asia. With al-Baghdadi's death, it may be poised to do so. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much to our two distinguished speakers. I suppose I should open by saying I really enjoyed your papers, with a note of surprise, but since I invited you both, then the surprise was somewhat muted. And I do apologize for volunteering myself for the discussant role in an outrageous gesture of Wilsonian self-determination. But seriously, thank you. Two very provocative papers. It does seem to me that when we are discussing terrorism, that the real value of historians is the good historians do the present and the future as well as the past, because they know that these are not fixed states. And I wonder, thinking in those terms, whether I could start really by picking up Chris's adroitly thrown Churchillian gauntlet. The further we look back, the further ahead we can see. I suppose my question is simply, yes, but what do we see? Because it seems to me one could look at this two ways. And again, I fully admit I'm having my therapy here. These are things that I have been thinking about in a separate vein in my own work, which is very global North, Western Europe and USA-centric, I'm afraid. But thinking about those parts of the world which I know best, it seems to me one could take a long-term view and reach two diametrically opposed conclusions. The first might be that these are very good times. If we take a broad view, I think this was sort of hinted by Martha and some other people recently, that perhaps we don't want to just keep trying to look at terrorism just in a box, although definitions are clearly important. But if we take a broad view, and if I can sort of rival Chris for acronym coining of what I think of as VHN, violent human nastiness, genocide, war, terrorism, and so on and so forth. If we take a broad view of VHN, and certainly in this part of the world, these have been fantastic times. When was the last revolution in Western Europe? Well, the last one that sort of briefly succeeded would be, I suppose, 1848, and the other revolutions have occurred, but they've been sort of byproducts of wars. That's a long time back. Even if one takes a revolutionary situation, you know, that Marxist term, a sort of comfort blanket term, for it didn't become a revolution, but it nearly did. You know, even if one takes a revolutionary situation, how far back would one have to go? Probably Paris, May 1968. You know, what was the last sort of major interstate clash or war in Western Europe? What comes to my mind is the glorious Cod War of 1975, you know, entire casualties, one poor Icelandic coast guard who had a heart attack and a whole load of cod. The last coup in Western Europe, Madrid, 1981 or so. Compared to earlier generations, these have been very good times, and it's often seemed to me as a historian blown in on a side wind into terrorism studies, that my early reactions in the early years was to honestly struggle with what the security services were coping with, certainly compared even to the IRA, is what seemed to be bubbling up from the sort of violent Salafist scene, seemed incredibly chaotic, amateur, ill-organized, and so on and so forth. And also what is often not said, fine, there are converts, but it's primarily, in this part of the world, a diasporic phenomenon. It's a tiny fringe of a minority, or minority communities. This is not system threatening. So, as I say, you could make that case that, you know, these are, taking a very long-term view, these are good times. And yet, as we've heard, I think in these two papers, one could also argue much the opposite, and I was actually struck by the dystopianism. Chris, it's unfair perhaps to call you out on the, I don't think you verbally said this, but on the written view of the paper you were making the powerful point about why would weapons of mass destruction be some sort of historic exception. They will be tried eventually. Someone will try and successfully carry them off, and you talked in, if I may say so, perhaps not Marxist, but strikingly Marxian language of the iron laws of history. You know, that's a bleak vision. Bruce, equally, you know, concentrating on the far right, and, you know, let's, again, not overlook an obvious point, the potential for expansion of the far right, I think, in this part of the world, and North America, is much greater than violent Salafism. That, you know, there seem to be very new and nasty things bubbling up, which, as we've, you know, covered in earlier discussions, are deeply intertwined with social and technological change. The entire incel movement, you know, the losers of the sexual revolution, which is, you know, sort of powered by the endlessly renewable energy of self-pity. And it's hard to see, you know, that going away anytime soon, but also just this acceleration of news and how fast atrocity can be disseminated is, you know, itself creates imitative and destabilizing effects. If it took the news of the fall of the Bastille nearly 2 weeks in July 1789 to reach Norfolk and eastern England, it took the news of the assassination of President Kennedy in 1963 about 6 hours for 99.7% of people surveyed to have heard of it. In 2019, we've reached the macabre milestone of performance atrocity as live entertainment in the Christchurch Mosque. And something about that sort of inexorable acceleration and imitation seems to me deeply worrying. So I'm afraid I'm just going to finish my discussant remarks with a deliberately wide-angled, wide-eyed, hello magazine type question, which to both speakers, how worried for the future are you?
Good. Do you want to start?
Yes, thank you very much.
That last chapter.
What a pleasure it is to agree with absolutely everything that Tim says. There's just one possible minor point of differentiation between us. There's no contradiction between what he says about the best times. I mean, I can tell you the day when it will all end. That's the 12th of December. But I'm not going to. I'm not going to engage in micro forecasting. So, I mean, these are the best times that some parts of the world, ours in particular, have ever lived through. But that in no way contradicts the inevitability of the future. Now, one of two things has to be the case: that weapons of mass destruction will be the only human invention, since there were human inventions, not to spread around, or that they will spread. Now, it seems to me that the probability that they will not be a 1 in 10 million exception actually it would be more than 10 million, wouldn't it? From them doing the same as all other human inventions, proliferating, I think the probabilities are perfectly clear. What I think we, despite Boris's book, Boris is actually quite good in my judgment, and more important, the judgment of those people who know more than I do about the Roman Empire. His book on the Roman Empire is pretty good. His book on Churchill is not very good, and it seeks to set up what we can learn from Churchill, but he completely leaves out intelligence. But what Churchill was better at than anybody else in British, and not simply British, history was the fact that intelligence, and indeed controversial information, is only any good if the policy maker is willing to have truth told to power. Now, I mean, the best agents ever operating in Britain, after all, were the Magnificent Five, not wholly accidentally recruited from Cambridge University. And I think that is accepted. Putin is still putting up memorials to Putin. Indeed, only last year, the SVR, Foreign Intelligence Agency, renamed the square just next to its headquarters Putin Square. But because they told the KGB, no, it wasn't called that then, but that's what it's called now, and therefore Stalin during the Second World War, what they thought was going on, the best agents in the whole of Russian history were regarded for a couple of years at a British deception. Now compare that with Churchill. Churchill was absolutely convinced, instinct, I think, rather than evidence, that Germany was going to engage in a surprise attack in the summer of 1941 against Russia, Operation Barbarossa. The Joint Intelligence Committee disagreed. He made no attempt whatever to get them to change their views. Winston was not perfect. I mean, if he were perfect, we'd know he'd never existed. But his susceptibility to being told truth to power, and where does it go back to? It goes back to that picture that I showed a bit earlier. The reason that Elizabeth I and Walsingham were so good is that he did not hesitate to tell her unwelcome information at those daily meetings. And there's a wonderful story about how, when told something politically inconvenient, she took off her slipper. Thank goodness she didn't wear boots or high heels. Threw it at him and caught him on the side of the head. Now, I think that is an absolutely perfect relationship between an intelligence chief and a policy maker. So we have been, in the 16th century, when we, what a wonderful decade. In the 1580s, we become the world's best at theatre and the world's best at intelligence. And the overlap between the two, it's just too wonderful. What else do we get from Winston? And he saw it with a clarity that nobody else had. I mean, the reason why it's so dismal being in most intelligence services as opposed to being in a great university like this is that, when you've discovered something or have a good idea, what do? You go off and discuss it with colleagues. I mean, virtually everybody, when they were describing their researches, talked about sharing it with colleagues. Well, you wouldn't do that if you were in most of the world's intelligence services. So the intelligence services are in most countries the only example in history of intelligent people who cannot share their thoughts with other people, except if you're a member of the Five Eyes. Now, there was nobody who was a greater fan of the alliance between the five of the English-speaking intelligence agencies. And what that has produced is the ability of all of the five intelligence agencies to test their conclusions against other people. So just finally, one example, which has never happened before in the history of the world and could not happen anywhere in the world now outside the Five Eyes. I was extremely fortunate to be the authorized historian. Well, actually, I was the official historian who wrote an authorized history of MI5, and as you'll see from the introduction, these were my views, and I won't go in for more self-justification. So far as the MI6, SIS is concerned, similar arrangement. When GCHQ decided to celebrate their 100th birthday with an official historian, GCHQ, having so many mathematicians, doesn't count all that well. And so it's actually coming out on their 101st birthday, as opposed to. But they chose a Canadian historian, John Ferris, because he was probably the best candidate. Now, the idea that the French will ever choose a German historian to write their history, or vice versa, I don't think so. So to quote Tim, these are jolly good times. Thank you for drawing that to our attention. Over to Bruce.
Yeah, I probably reflect my, the reason for my gray beard is because of my abiding pessimism. Not to wax too sociologically or politically or broadly, but I mean, all of these terrorist threats, as indeed many other threats, I think pose a direct challenge to the Western liberal values that we all have cherished for centuries now, that are assailed with greater ferocity, and indeed to the post-war international order that has largely kept the peace. Now, there are many that would argue that post-war international order is fundamentally northern, western, white, and hegemonic. But with 1 million Uyghurs, for instance, in detention camps in China, one wonders what the alternatives are, especially when that approach, as we heard, is being marketed as a solution to all of our counterterrorism woes. I think a reason that I'm also worried, and this is something that has come up again and again in the context, at least of America's electoral processes, and it's something that Audrey very cogently talked about this morning, and it's something I think we still don't understand, is the power of the internet, social media, and the immediacy of communications. Forget about terrorism. Think about the kinds of pornographic child abuse and violence against children that is absolute rampant across the internet now. I mean, this is an enormous problem, much worse than even terrorism. But this is also one of the challenges we face. And of course, at the conference 5 years ago, John Mueller, as he often is very eloquently discussed, how we focus a disproportionate amount of resources, attention, money, and so on terrorism, as opposed, let's say, to violent child abuse, which is, as I said, arguably more common. But the point is, there's a reality that whether you have elected or unelected officials, we hold them to a certain standard as citizens of either China or the United States, or the United Kingdom or Canada, that they're going to keep us safe. And we, despite the deaths on roads, the deaths by being struck by lightning, when people are killed by terrorists, it elicits a very different public demand on government and on elected officials. One that I would argue is only heightened and increased in the post-9/11 environment, where any single terrorist incident is seen as this catastrophic defeat, and not going back to one of Paul Wilkinson's famous aphorisms, is that, like a goalkeeper can prevent all the shots on goal, but the one that gets in is what everybody remembers and what stirs them up. So my concern is that we basically had, for a little bit more than a decade and a half, a luxury in many of our countries of focusing in terms of national security threats exclusively on that posed by the Salafi jihadi movement. And it's still going on. And in fact, in some respects, we could debate whether it's worse or not, but it still exists and it's not going away. And there's clearly a new generation of recruits and fighters that are going to carry on the struggle. What worries me is that now we're confronted by threats from competing great powers, from states attempting to undermine Western liberal democracies, and even from terrorist movements that even in my career, my first publication at the RAND Corporation 37 years ago was on right-wing terrorism in Europe. And in the 1980s and 1990s, I devoted considerable energy and attention to that subject. But like everyone else, when 9/11 happened, we were riveted on the Salafi jihadi threat, in part because I thought we'd gotten on top of that threat, that was the old kind of terrorism, as it were. But we see now how we're confronted by not just as I described the violent far-right extremists, but violent far-left and incels. And what they all have in common is that we used to be able to discuss terrorism meaningfully as being a domestic phenomena. When you look at these movements, and including the Salafi jihadi ones, but I'm really talking about these violent extremist movements, they're transnational, they're not domestic. They're actively making contacts with one another, and they're attempting to navigate within the existing legal authorities and even intelligence sharing agreements in order to thrive. American white supremacists, for instance, going off to the Ukraine to train in terrorism and combat. Now, frankly, people of a certain nationality with certain stamps in their passport and perhaps of a certain skin color and religion are far more likely to be pulled aside by government officials when they attempt to re-enter their homelands than Caucasian males, or females for that matter, who have gone off to places like the Ukraine and aren't arousing that same type of suspicion. So the point I'm trying to make is that we were once confronted, and we blew it, against the Salafi jihadi threat. We did not suppress it. It still exists. Whether it's getting worse or not, we could debate, but it's still out there. But now, just as the United States counterterrorism strategy last year stated, we're joined by this raft of additional threats. And it's imposed on law enforcement and intelligence agencies that are already overstretched, that are already seeing the pressures from a society, as I described at the beginning of my paper, that is tired of the war on terrorism, is tired with the Middle East, is tired with South Asia, for example, and therefore lacks the resources, or sees those resources perhaps diminishing at a time when threats are growing. And also that our entire training and orientation has been oriented towards eliminating terrorist leaders, Baghdadi the latest example, taking down terrorist organizations. I'm not opposed to either of them. But what terrorist group did Dylann Roof belong to? Who gave him his orders in Charleston, South Carolina? What terrorist group did Brenton Tarrant belong to? The list goes on and on. So that's what I think makes me a bit pessimistic, is that everybody's tired of terrorism. I don't blame them. But precisely at a moment when the threat is becoming much more diversified and much more complex, and when a lot of the paradigms that haven't worked all that well over the past 2 decades either, but at least have held back the threat from becoming more severe, are really in need of reassessment and of updating if we're going to be capable of countering the raft of potential threats we might see in the future.
The most important part is your questions. Please.